This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, welcome, thank you for coming. My name is Alex Green, I'm on the conveners of the Public History Seminar. But this is kind of an unusual event because we've got 3 seminars here represented, and in a moment I'm just going to ask you to just introduce yourselves and sort of explain your interest in this particular seminar. So we've also got the digital history and the history of sexuality seminars involved as well, which is fantastic. So just before I do that, just to explain the format, which is slightly different. So what we're going to have is we're going to hear from Justin and from Alison in sort of standard seminar form, but then we're going to have very short responses from people from the 3 seminars, just to reflect a bit on what the significance of this project might be for the digital history, for the history of sexuality and for public history. And then we'll open it up for sort of questions and discussion. So I think without further ado, shall we do the introductions and then I'll hand over to you.
Well, hello, welcome. And it's great to, I mean, the thing about Pride of Place, as you'll hear, is that it's a project which, ripples out. So, various people here who I haven't necessarily met yet, but have something to do with Pride of Place. Great, it's welcome. It's fantastic to see you here, and let's have a chat. My name's Alison Oram, and I am a Professor of Social and Cultural History at Leeds Beckett University, and lead this project, Pride of Place. I've done a lot of work on lesbian and queer history, particularly 20th century, and in recent years I've also worked quite a lot on historic houses. So that's my kind of academic background.
Sure. My name is Justin Bengry. I'm a research fellow at Birkbeck. I've been working on the Pride of Place project since it was launched as the lead researcher, but I've handed over my duties to the incredibly competent Claire Hayward, and I'm now working on a project called Queer Beyond London, looking at sexuality and locality outside of the metropolis in Leeds, Manchester, Plymouth, and Brighton, and working with Alison, who's a lead on that, along with Matt Cook at Birkbeck. So we've got a good working relationship.
We certainly have. So Justin and I email each other, and I don't know, in my case, Justin's more organised, allocated to whichever project folder it falls into. But yes, we want to flag up Queer Beyond London that this particular seminar is on the Pride of Place project. I'm going to talk first, and then Justin's going to follow on. And we also have apologies from Rosie Sherrington from Historic England, who was also going to make up the panel, but she unfortunately can't make it. My paper's probably a bit more kind of, I've got it written down, and then Justin is going to add material, particularly on the mapping aspects. So, yes, I'm going to show you 2 or 3 places. On the top left, it's Dungeness, Derek Jarman's home. On the right, there's one of my female husbands from my book on women's cross-dressing, gender crossing in the 20th century. They're getting married at a church in outer London in Kent in 1954. And third picture is Shouldton Hall. For once I'm not going to talk about Alice this day, but she's often a fantastic case study. And the picture on the bottom right is an anti-Clause 28 demonstration in Manchester in Albert Square in 1988. So I've shown you those 4 places to make the point that they are all sites of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or queer heritage in very different ways. These are homes and public places where people acted on their same-sex love and desire for each other, places where they crossed gender to pass the opposite sex, buildings where courageous individuals organised politically to change homophobic laws, and sites of commemoration of same-sex love. And Same-sex love and gender diversity have long been part of England's history and heritage, but for many years these histories have been relatively hidden, especially in public history and at heritage sites, less so obviously in publishing. So it's really significant that in 2015, Historic England, the government agency responsible for managing the historic environment, decided to fund Pride of Place with a team, currently we have a team of around 6 people, directed from Leeds Beckett University, with the aim of uncovering these untold queer histories of buildings and places that people have lived alongside for generations. So at Leeds Beckett, my colleagues Ian Strange, who's a Professor of Planning, and Bronwyn Edwards, who's a social geographer, are part of the team, and our external researchers include Justin in the past and now Claire Hayward. And also Gertie Whitworth, who's working with Teachers' Resources, and Rob Bevan, who's one amongst other things is the architectural critic for the London Standard. In this project, we use LGBTQ or queer as an all-inclusive term. LGBTQ identities, as we understand them today, only date from the last decade of the 20th century. Sexualities are expressed and labelled differently in different historical periods. And so as a historian, I might feel more comfortable talking about same-sex love or gender-crossing identification rather than putting this kind of contemporary label onto people in the past. But for the purposes of this project, at least, we are using the term queer as an umbrella shorthand for a whole range of LGBTQ communities, with the aim of recognising the diversity of these communities. So as a way of signalling the breadth of people and identities that we hope to appeal to in the project and represent in the project. The first publicly accessible outcome of the project is the interactive crowdsourced map, which we'll come back to. The other outputs in the jargon, the other things we're going to produce in the project by September 2016, which is when the launch, or the next big launch happens. We're going to be producing a number of things, which are summarised here really. An online exhibition on LGBTQ heritage, teachers' resources for secondary school use, which again will be available online. We're also going to be intervening to some extent within Historic England's processes and amending some of the list descriptions that already exist for nationally listed buildings, and add in LGBTQ social history commentary as well to a number of those. And we are going to produce some online guides, well, 2 online guides, one aimed at local authorities and the other at the general public, in order to encourage people to understand the processes for listing buildings, not only at national level, but perhaps more importantly at local level with local authorities, so as to enable the designation and protection, or at least partial protection, of LGBT significant buildings. Now, this of course is a very timely project. Around the country, and especially in areas of considerable urban redevelopment, like London, there's a concern that landmark gay pubs and other buildings are under threat and are disappearing. Last September, and following a massive campaign, the Royal Vauxhall Tavern in central South London, Vauxhall, became the first building to be given national listed status on the grounds of its significance to LGBT history. It was listed at grade 2. Thus, well, I was going to, perhaps this is a bit histrionic, but thus saving it from redevelopment into luxury flats. It certainly protects its existence and its status as a queer venue. And the Royal Vauxhall Tavern is currently the only designated heritage asset in the country whose listing has been due mainly to its long LGBTQ association. I mean, it also had to have a description of its architectural merits. You know, it's a lovely old Victorian pub, but I think only dates from the 1860s. But of course, it also has much longer historical connections in its neighbourhood, which has long been a lesbian and gay neighbourhood, but before that, of course, Vauxhall pleasure gardens dating back hundreds of years. So the Royal Vauxhall Tavern is, the kind of glorious example, but around the country, many places and communities are also trying to make sites known and listed. So in Leeds, for example, I find myself having to do these quick adaptations between the north and the south, but in Leeds, a very long-standing gay pub, which is now called the New Penny, that started off being called the Hope and Anchor from the 1950s. The local community has got approval for a local authority blue plaque, which should be making its appearance within the next month or so. So, these kinds of concerns to protect queer heritage are not only rooted in London. So, I wanted to raise two sets of questions in my part of the panel. First of all, how has the heritage establishment come to endorse and promote LGBTQ heritage? Why now? So this is the question I'm kind of asking as a historian. Why these policy changes in recent contemporary history? And I'm going to kind of sketch out some of that. And then secondly, in the Pride of Place project, how, or particularly in relation to the map, how are we promoting these landmarks of queer sexuality, and how are the new technologies of interactive mapping being used, and what issues does that raise, having a crowdsourced map? What issues does it raise around public history? So, start off with the first set of issues around policy changes. So this is a very sort of brief overview of policy changes in the UK and the influence this has had on public bodies and heritage in particular. And of course we have to recognise that policies in the first place grow out of LGBTQ activism and the pressure put on local and national governments, and then those policy shifts in turn change cultural attitudes further, so that public attitudes towards LGBT legislation and issues has changed. So in the UK, there have been rapid shifts on LGBT rights, starting from the new Labour government's promotion of social inclusion at the beginning of the century, in around from 2000. That shift was important. Social inclusion meant a whole load of things, and it's quite an interesting term to debate and look at how it was interpreted differently by different bodies. But certainly through DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, this turn to social inclusion encouraged and enabled cultural bodies like museums and archives in particular to actively take up the issues of equality and inclusion in relation to class, race, gender, and for some that legitimised early steps in queer heritage. I was involved as one of the many National Archives advisory bodies during that time, and they started to work on issues like lesbian and gay inclusion. Matt Holbrook's guide to how to use the archives to look for lesbian and gay material is up on the National Archives website and has been for some years. So the National Archives, just as an example, that stands for many. I believe that what was it called? It wasn't a piece of legislation, it was more like a directive. It also encouraged a wide remit for the Heritage Lottery Fund to make grants to community groups, including LGBT history projects at a local level. And there have been very many of those, over 60, that had something to do with lesbian and gay history, but also to do with theatre and so on. But there certainly have been a lot of those since about 2002. Further acts that are perhaps more well known gave LGBT people greater legal equalities, and of course the Equalities Act of 2010 outlawed discrimination against groups of people with protected characteristics, including sexual orientation and gender reassignment, alongside disability and race and so on. A further provision of the 2010 Act was to create a public sector equality duty on all bodies delivering public services to proactively develop strategies to create greater equality and to monitor their progress. So that means that public bodies such as local authorities have this as an active duty, including in their arts and cultural provision. In contrast, charities, for example the National Trust, simply have to avoid discrimination. They don't have a duty to actively promote the interests of minorities. Now, as we know, the Equality Act 2010 was immediately followed by a Conservative-led coalition government and austerity and public funding cuts and so on. But that government did continue a liberal, or at least the normalising trend, by passing the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act in 2013. The Civil Partnership Act of 2004, more than 10 years ago now, had enabled same-sex couples to share all the benefits of marriage and civil ceremonies. And I think this was highly significant in pushing forward social attitudes at a kind of national level, but also at a local level. I mean, civil partnerships are sandwiched in between, heterosexual marriages at local town halls. I mean, I think that's what many people have observed, not only me, that has made a huge difference to public acceptance of same-sex relationships, reinforced, of course, by the 2013 legislation. But the Civil Partnerships Act had begun that process of homonormativity many years earlier. Now, of course, austerity and other legislative change has rolled back some of these provisions. For example, there's been a weakening of the audit on the public sector equality duty and so on, and that has enabled some public bodies to kind of retreat a bit from LGBT equalities work. But nevertheless, there is still a legislative obligation on public bodies to do that. And originally very much behind the curve, Heritage has begun to catch up with museums and archives in recognising queer history and diversity. I mean, some of you may know John Vincent's book, which summarised change over the 20 or 30 years in libraries and, he himself was a librarian, and archives and so on. And there was very little when it was published only 2 or 3 years ago about the heritage sector. And so it's, the change there has been much more recent. So, Historic England is part of this general change. What Historic England, I mean, if Rosie was here, she could tell you herself, but she has observed to me that a key step for Historic England, English Heritage as it was before last spring, was the bicentenary of the abolition of slavery in 2007, and that was also quite a prompt for many museums to think about diversity in new ways. English Heritage funded research on historic houses that have been built on the proceeds of slavery and produced an excellent book edited by Han and Dresser on country houses and the legacy of slavery. And you can also download it for free on the Historic England website, as I advise my students to. The English Heritage in 2012 carried out quite a wide consultation exercise on underrepresented heritage and recommended that the body did more than they had been doing. Hence, the projects on disability and heritage and now LGBTQ heritage. So, that's kind of a quick dash through some of the key issues that help to explain this current moment in LGBTQ heritage, the various levers of change, government legislation, increasing acceptance and normalisation of lesbian, gay and trans rights. But a further factor enabling some of this work, or at least making it possible to carry out in an era of public spending cuts, and Historic England have had a huge share of cuts. They've lost a huge proportion of their staff. So a further factor that enables some of this work to continue is the availability of digital technologies and social media, which our project relies quite heavily on. So, this is what you see if you, well, one of the pages that are currently up on the Historic England website connected with this project. So I'm now going to go on to the sort of second set of questions around the map and crowdsourcing. Sorry, I'm going fast through this. Let's leave it there for the moment. One of the already achieved aims is to produce a crowdsourced map of sites of interest of LGBTQ heritage. So all members of the public, anybody and everybody, can pin sites onto a map of England. Whether you're a member of the public, a member of an LGBTQ community group of some kind, or an academic, or whatever. So such sites might include clubs that we used to go to, or still go to in some cases. There's a huge range of potential sites that have been, can be, and are being posted or pinned onto the map. They might be buildings connected with iconic gay figures from the past, well-known figures such as Edward Carpenter, for example. They may be include historic sites, including places where men were prosecuted for cruising, medieval churches where famous queer couples were buried or memorialised, or of course not famous couples at all, but same-sex couples. The map, where's it gone? Contributors to the map can decide which of 8 to 10 themes they wish to post under. These include themes such as arts and culture, pubs, clubs and so on, workplaces. We've added 1 or 2 themes in response to feedback. Sorry, you weren't going to read this, I'm just sort of showing it impressionistically really. And then you can also choose from a long list of keywords that include building types, so as to fit with Historic England's archives and so on. You can choose decades, you can choose relevance to identity categories and so on. There are dozens and dozens of keywords. You can load pictures, but you don't have to. If you've got a picture of the site, that can be loaded. You can include links to another website, but again, you don't have to. You can also write quite a lot of commentary about a place, or simply a few words of explanation. So, Justin will no doubt talk a bit more about that. But I wanted to give just 3 examples of some of these sorts of places that have been mapped, and also to kind of sort of foreshadow some of my points about who maps what. And perhaps actually these 3 choices are not necessarily representative, but this is one of the first, one of the earliest locations. We haven't had an awful lot from archaeologists, but we have had this site. It's Catterick in North Yorkshire. You can just see the North Sea on the top right. And Catterick's there in the middle with the blue pin. So this is a location that goes back to Roman Britain. In Catterick, present-day Catterick, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a 4th century AD Gallus, a gender-crossing priest of the goddess Cybele. Born a man, a Gallus would self-castrate, cross-dress, and take a woman's role to demonstrate commitment to Cybele. This Gallus, this is an artist's impression, but this skeleton, a male skeleton, was excavated with jet jewellery and other female accessories that suggested its status. Of course, we don't have, there is one academic article, as far as I'm aware, on this this burial, this discovery of this burial, and we don't have the evidence to know whether this person even approximated to our contemporary ideas about transgender. But clearly this person's social and cultural role in Roman society illuminates gender diversity amongst some of the most recorded peoples in Britain. So that's one of the earliest sites that we have. I'm rushing on a few centuries here to, and I won't show you the map even, it's Covent Garden, we all know where that is. And the maps don't reproduce particularly well on PowerPoints. But this is to illustrate one example of places of socialising and cruising between men. Already in the 18th century, specific places came to have reputations as sites where sodomites or queer men might congregate or look for sexual opportunities. And of course, these locations for public socialising and sex mostly appear in the record because of the discovery of those men by the authorities and of, normally their prosecution. That's, how we know about them as historians. I've chosen this one though because the men weren't always, in the historical record, the men weren't always only victims of oppression and the law, but sometimes spoke back in their own defence. This is a case from 1718, when a watchman discovered two men having sex against the railings of St Paul's Church in Covent Garden, London. Covent Garden, of course, big market area, prostitution, sexual prostitution, and so on and so forth. So watchman discovered two men having sex. You can see St Paul's Church at the back there, it still remains today, and proceeded to call them filthy sodomites. One of the men, whose breeches were down around his ankles, replied, "Sirrah, what's that to you? Can't I make use of my own body? I've done nothing but what I will do again." So that's a kind of more heartening example of the hundreds that historians, well, particularly Richter Norton, have accumulated and written about. And Richter's got his own website with a lot of these examples on them. My third example, my third example kind of comes into the pubs and clubs category, and it's a 20th century example, and it comes from one of our recent pinning parties, the London Metropolitan Archives annual LGBTQ conference, which was in early December last year. Justin and I had a lunchtime pinning party where we encouraged people to put places onto the map and talk to them about it. And I talked to a woman who gave permission to be named Vito, Eileen Ward, and we posted this site on the map, and she described, and we transcribed what she had written about it. It's the Horse and Groom pub in Southampton Dockyard in the 1960s. And Vito said, "This was the first gay pub I went to in the mid-1960s when I was serving in the Women's Royal Naval Service in Leeds, Solent. The Horse and Groom was extraordinary. It was a rough place that welcomed everyone, black seamen, queer people and so on. People who wouldn't have been welcomed in ordinary places as themselves. Many women dressed as men and had men's names. Often their girlfriends worked as prostitutes. I can still feel the excitement of being able to be there as myself for 2 hours of the day and be with a girlfriend." She says, "I used to change my clothes in the car before I went in. In those days in the Navy, we wore pinky rings to identify ourselves as lesbians. You had to identify either as butch or femme. I swapped between those choices." And in fact, she was discharged from the Navy on account of, as many servicemen women were, when their same-sex relationships were discovered. So, new mapping technologies mean that mapping has become, very fashionable. Yep. In the past few years, lots of history projects do mapping now, and I think we thought when we started doing this that, crowdsourced mapping, technology's out there, it's easy, it's straightforward. It's not quite as straightforward as that though. These technologies are quite unevenly spread, raising questions of who has the time and money and access to manage them properly. So, do mapping technologies make an LGBTQ heritage map accessible to all? Is this truly a democratic method for queer public history? who posts on it, and so whose history does this represent? I mean, the map will remain, we hope, as a resource for the future as well as being a record of the past. Who has access to technology? I mean, it's reasonably straightforward to pin somewhere on the map, but it's slightly clunky. Who has the technology, but also who has the time to do it? We, as I'll say in a moment, or Justin might also talk about, this is a volunteer-oriented project. We rely on people out there to post places on the map. Who puts stuff on any of these things? Who puts stuff on Wikipedia or TripAdvisor? Whoever has the time, I don't know. And of course, will it be representative of the diversity within LGBTQ heritage? So, as I've mentioned, we've built partnerships with community groups, some of who have been much more active than others. Maybe I'll leave it to Justin to talk about the Nottingham group, but they vie with London for a number of sites on the map because they've got the people there have got the energy and interest to do it. And we've also got a Pride of Place blog from about Nottingham as well. Professional historians who work on LGBTQ history have also posted. We have several on our steering group, and of course we try to network nationally and encourage people to do that. And thank you for anyone in this room who's posted their sites. And in this slightly later stage of the project, there's also been a kind of intermediate level of mapping, which is quite interesting, which is where people who are volunteers, but kind of in a semi-official capacity. There's a staff member at Historic England, for example, who puts in a lot of hours on this project, and as well as volunteers who have a small group of volunteers who are putting or have put material directly from academic books, lesbian gay histories that exist, onto the map. So it's not sort of, there are questions about how crowdsourced is crowdsourced, and what are the different intermediate levels of help that this wouldn't have been possible without. And Rick Norton kindly agreed, to have much of his material put onto our map with acknowledgement to his work, as indeed we try to acknowledge all historians' work. So that's kind of one of the questions. And actually my final issue, I think, is the question about what's the, this is kind of classic, I suppose, articulated in various ways in public history. How can we maintain the project as democratic and accessible on the one hand, but also have credibility and academic rigour on the other hand? I mean, Historic England, of course, are the government agency, and they've always wanted to protect their standards. They promote themselves as having, expertise in architecture and heritage and history. And certainly, it's an authoritative body, which makes it really important that it's paid for this project and is endorsing it across the heritage sector generally. So, and as academic consultants, we're also concerned with our own professional credibility. We don't want any old stuff floating around under our name. So, it's set up as a democratic wiki-like process, but what kinds of authority does the map convey about its contents? We trialled an early version of the map as long ago now as May 2015, which feels like quite a long time ago now, doesn't it? And this was kind of with a self-selected group in London of people who were concerned and interested and committed to LGBTQ history. And they were quite divided on this issue. Some people wanted all information on the map to be absolutely verified, that they could rely on it, that it had to be reliable and accurate, and saw this as really important. And others believed equally strongly that the range of perspectives and interpretations that were available through crowdsourcing was the most exciting part. Why don't you go out and interview people, etc., etc. Well, we'd love to if we had the time and money. And of course, the answer to this, although I'm not suggesting that this is the final answer, is the wiki answer, that it should be self-correcting. People can add further information, people can So that's not my view of this club in the 1980s or whatever. My experience was different. But are we able to encourage this enough? Is it actually happening sufficiently? And of course, it also raises questions about what is the status of various kinds of knowledge, and perhaps it has parallels with oral history and questions about popular memory. So this, what we're doing is a combination of popular and elite knowledge in a way. We're collecting places, we're collecting facts from various authors and very different kinds of sources. So this map, or the body of knowledge that it represents and will continue to represent, suggests that this information or this knowledge is arrived at by consensus. It's not a truth which can always be footnoted. So, just to sort of put that question out there, what is public history about? Is it about what is the status of the historical knowledge that it produces? So, I suppose just to sort of finish, we certainly hope that the Pride of Place project will change heritage processes from the top down, and hope to influence historic England a little bit. At least that's what they wanted to happen, and also from the bottom up as a crowdsourced queer history resource. So that's me, and I'll hand over to Justin. Shall we swap seats?
We'll switch. Yeah. I'll put the map up on the on the screen.
Oh, and those are our contact details.
We're back to them.
But you can just Google Pride of Place and historic England and you'll come up with everything you might need.
Can I give you a Does anyone need a moment to take that down before I take it all away and put the actual map up online?
The Facebook page is great. Justin and now Claire put up a post at least once a week on an interesting building.
Yeah, we've managed to have buildings featured, blogs going up. We'll be writing some blogs ourselves, but we've also had guest blogs from people writing about, one about Nottingham. Nottingham features prominently in the project, unexpectedly, and a blog about trans histories that was contributed by an individual as well. And it was published also at, that was a horrible sound, there we go. And then the other blog, the trans blog, was also published in Huffington Post, so it's getting pretty good distribution in terms of people being aware of the project and speaking to communities beyond our immediate one in academia in London, in the UK even. But to get to my portion of this evening, I want to focus more on the practical sides of mapping and the issues that we've encountered in trying to build this project around a crowdsourced map, at least in the first instance, before the other outputs that Alison described. And we always imagined the project as a crowdsourced one when we're putting the project together, and one that would really draw upon this collective of knowledge about the LGBTQ past, both in terms of this vast body of knowledge that's been written about by scholars, by public historians, popular historians even, but also from the wider general community that might be aware of various facets of LGBTQ history that hasn't yet distilled into official historical writing. And that's really important because there's so much material within living memory that there is no other record of. And so we've had quite an interesting task, both to think about how to access that kind of information, places for which there's no official historical record of it being an LGBTQ heritage site, and yet for individuals it holds that resonance and holds that importance from their own lives, their own experiences, from wider community experiences that might be acknowledged in that community but not recorded in the ways that we anticipate. But in looking at these questions, we've also wanted to explode outward what can constitute a location of LGBTQ heritage. And Alison was speaking to that at the beginning as well, that you saw the range of sites, some of the range of sites that we've already mapped. And we're trying to get contributors and participants to think as widely and as expansively as possible about what can constitute an LGBTQ heritage site. At least for this map. When we write up the exhibition that will be housed at Historic England, of course we can only include so much on there. We want to do justice as best we can to the range of locations we found. But on the map, which is crowdsourced, hopefully that will expand, and continue to do so after we're no longer working on the project. We were at one event where a man in the audience said, well, what are you going to do? Because what are you going to happen if the entire map is just covered in blue and you don't see England anymore? That's fantastic. Would that happen? Would that would be absolutely wonderful to see, because of course that would suggest this incredible both volume of material, but also necessarily the incredible range of places that can be included under the umbrella of LGBTQ history. And looking at the map, you can see the categories. You might be able to read that a bit easier now on the projection, that we're looking across a number of categories. So the typical things that might appear also in historical literature: activism, crime and the law, pubs and clubs. These are very well represented in historic documents, at least insofar as LGBTQ history can be. Those are quite represented as well. But we wanted to look as well at love and intimacy, something that evades definition a bit, and our contributors have sometimes wondered what exactly is included in that. Or domestic spaces, getting people to think about their own homes and spaces of domestic relationships as having an historical resonance and importance. And I think that's been something that we've set out for ourselves as well, is to really get contributors to think about everything that could be included in LGBTQ history. We've often said at presentations that every location has an LGBTQ heritage significance when we scratch the surface of it and start thinking about the range of experiences that those can include. And I'll show you a couple examples a little bit later on that demonstrate exactly what that can in fact include. But convincing people, in fact, that their own experiences are relevant to heritage and to history is sometimes a bit of an uphill battle. Some people want to hear from the experts what constitutes history, what constitutes heritage, and for us to teach them and tell them what's important, and this is the stuff that you need to know about your past, your community's past, and if that's not your community, LGBTQ heritage and history for others. And in fact, we're trying to get people to think about the minutiae of their own lives as being historically significant as well, and the places where that happens as being worthy of identification on the map. So there's been quite a lot of outreach in that regard, having just these basic kinds of conversations, saying, tell me a story about your life. That can go onto this if you're willing to share it, if you're interested in sharing it, and you can see your way to how that can be identified with a location. It's one of the outreach strategies that we've had. Alison mentioned the pinning parties, and this was based around a similar initiative in the States, where there's a couple mapping projects underway that are similar to this. One by the National Park Service, which started out interestingly in it's a much bigger project and has transformed a bit into a crowdsourced mapping project, sort of. It was intended to be crowdsourced, to have people submitting places almost in a more formalized kind of way. People would email in and say, here's all the locations that you need to know about. And the woman who is leading that started building a map for herself as a visual tool to see how that was working, and put that online, and in fact discovered that people were very interested in seeing that organized around a map, and having that familiarity of location as a way of organizing the LGBTQ past ended up becoming very, very useful to their project and subsequent ones. And certainly that's influenced us when we were writing out the proposal for this. So the pinning parties that they did, and that now we're doing some as well, serve multiple purposes. Obviously the primary one being, let's get locations on the map and build awareness of the project and outreach to multiple communities. It's also a way to access communities that aren't as readily identifiable on the map, or whose histories aren't as readily told or recorded. So certainly the map, as expansive as it is, gay male history predominates, unsurprisingly. And so of course we've sought to do more with women's and lesbian history, with trans histories where we can, with some bi history, black and ethnic minority histories, all of these areas that need further exploration and further interventions, but where work is ongoing and where overlaps between those histories and the queer past continues to be ongoing as well. But what we've ended up finding, interestingly, with the pinning parties is it ends up being much more a tool of interpersonal engagement, I'd say, and more almost like open houses about the project. People luckily take a lot of information about the project, and we found locations being pinned afterwards, after the event. People take information and thankfully continue to engage with it. But really, the pinning events end up being a lot about teaching people what the project is, and doing this kind of work that I've been telling you about, getting people to engage with the idea that their own personal lives can constitute histories and heritage, and that they can be builders of history, and it doesn't need to be left to us, so-called experts, in every instance, though of course we're bringing a lot of other research and knowledge and background to this to constitute that and contextualize, I should say, these histories. But it's really important to have that kind of engagement from the public, that kind of grassroots engagement and interest of them telling us, well, this is what I think constitutes LGBTQ history and heritage, and I want this to be represented in a map from a body as significant as Historic England. Looking a bit further at the map itself now, I mentioned the different categories that we've got here for actually adding a location. Oh, I should have logged in ahead of time. I'm used to a North American laptop. Now you all know my email address. I don't want to remember that. Anytime now. Oh, wrong password. Oh, gee.
If it uses American.
Oh, it could have been. You know what? We've got another one that's the LGBTQ places at. Again, the @ symbol.
You can kind of create your own account, or we've also got an anonymous one that people can use.
It's capitals for the password, isn't it, Claire?
It's lowercase.
Everything?
Yeah.
I want the everyday experience of a computer user.
There we go. Yeah, oh yeah. So, well, I mean, that does bring up one of the issues, that one of the obstacles with this map and with the other mapping technologies we used was people needing to log in. We did start with another provider called ZMaps that allowed for no login, just show up, click a point, and start describing it, which of course removed a lot of the barriers to participation. But there was a lot of other glitches with that software that made it just untenable going forward, and a lot of difficulties people had then with the submission process. So this ends up being quite a balance between what type of mapping provider and software ends up offering the most useful information and the most ease of engagement, but then also basic levels of accessibility, and whether people want to have to log in, whether people want to create an account, whether people want their own social media accounts tracked by the software that's being used. And that's certainly something that our users brought up on numerous occasions, and we've created anonymous login accounts for them for that purpose. But of course, it still provides, there's a level of inaccessibility in that regard that we just can't get around with the current software. The ideal, of course, is to have our own bespoke, designed, GIS-based mapping and submission system, which is the ultimate end product of the map that we're working with they'll be transferring over the content that we've collected in the map information that we've got into something that would then be locally housed on Historic England servers and designed by their staff to reflect the questions that we want addressed in the software, the opportunities for submission that we want to address, the types of information people are wanting to submit, because of course everything we've used until now with the software that's off the shelf, as it were, is limited into the types of fields that are available for submission and how much we can customize that. So it's incredibly important when doing a project like this to be able to have that flexibility. So we've got basic information, the type, name for the place, the address, which we'll anticipate, description. Alison read some of those, including all range of information people might want to submit, from the most basic, this was a lesbian bar in 1952, to a long personal story that gives a lot more texture to that, and we've had everything in between. Keywords, we have over 100 keywords in fact, so it covers everything that we could possibly think of, and users can create new keywords based on what for them is significant and what they want their location coded with. Web references, YouTube video has interestingly been something we've been able to submit for a few different sites. That's a bit of a bonus, I suppose. The kinds of sites then that people have submitted have ranged across all of that. So I want to as well quickly just take a look at a couple of those. So one, for instance, that I quite like is in Brixton. And I'm going to continue with that finishing. I'm going to be terrible and not create a new site. And this woman submitted to the map. And she was describing, she doesn't identify as LGBTQ herself, but she wanted to tell a story in the 1950s about two men that lived in her neighborhood and that babysat her when she was a child, and the closeness that she felt for this the same-sex male couple, and the role that they played in her life of being emotionally engaged and providing love, and the importance that continues to hold for her. Even though she doesn't know what happened to Cyril and Terry, she didn't stay in touch with them, but the experience of knowing these two men in the late 1950s, once she learned about the conditions under which these men lived, about criminalization, about the threat from the law in society, that she was blissfully unaware of as a child in the 1950s. It stayed with her, and she was keen to map that story. But actually, the reason this one's on the top of my mind was because she got a hold of us then and said, oh, I have this experience, but how does this fit into a project like this? So that then gets to that question that or that issue that I was mentioning earlier about what constitutes the LGBTQ past in a heritage location. She could potentially, well, she has put it to a specific address, so it does identify with the location, but that level of just interpersonal intimacy and connection certainly tell. It's not something that would show up typically in a mapping project for the LGBTQ past, but I think it really demonstrates an incredibly important relationship that shouldn't be omitted from these stories and shouldn't be omitted from the LGBTQ past, because it illuminates so much about what elements of queer history actually engage with other communities, and how queer individuals in the past live in a community that expands beyond the immediate LGBTQ communities that we've often done, and the subcultural communities that we've often done research into. Another example is in Etchingham. And so both of the ones that I'm showing this evening are in our love and intimacy category, because that was something where we were trying to find more to put in there and expand out what can be included there. And what we found for love and intimacy as well is memorials and graves often tell very intimate stories of people's lives, and relationships that we might not otherwise have access to, or relationships that only are illuminated in death. And so we have the example here of a 15th century memorial brass at the Assumption of the Blessed Mary and St. Nicholas in Etchingham for Elizabeth Etchingham and Agnes Oxenbridge. Early modernists in the room may already be familiar with this. But it is an example of a space, of a church, that could have multiple overlapping histories, LGBTQ histories as well. As Alison was saying, the church could hold a memorial that demonstrates the relationship between these two women. It could also be a site where relationships have been solidified afterwards. It could have been, some of the churches we've mapped have been meeting places for advocacy groups of later generations, or sites of sex and cruising, all in a single place, all overlayered across multiple centuries. And I think something that the map can do is really demonstrate that overlappingness of history over generations in a way that other ways of presenting the material doesn't do as effectively. And I think an ideal version of this map would better show those layers. And we haven't organized by categories, but I could well imagine something that demonstrates time in layers on a map. And certainly there's other projects that have been able to do that with other software. And I think for the LGBTQ past, that's especially relevant and resonant, given the incredible range of experiences that I've just described. In terms of community outreach as well, I think, well, I guess to start summing up a bit, the significance of the project overall, one of the significances is that engagement with the public on what constitutes the LGBTQ past, and diversifying what that can include. And up till now, we've mapped 1,325 places in England from Roman Britain to the present, and that does include all range of locations, including those that are currently active, because we've seen the project as well not only as a map to the past, but potentially an archive for the future. So we have had a lot of people spend a lot of time identifying clubs, pubs, advocacy locations, campaigning offices, things that potentially are going to be all too ephemeral themselves. And those are being mapped on the map, even as currently operating locations. And that's incredibly important because nothing has been undertaken of that sort in the past to map these for us outside. I suppose there's been some wonderful local community queer walking tours and things like that that would be of their moment and recognize perhaps what might have been going on in those moments. But I think in terms of a more consistent mapping of not just the worthy sites of the present, but we've got, well, like I said, all range of locations, to ephemeral clubs, saunas, whatever individuals have identified as being LGBTQ locations. And that brings in Nottingham. It's been interesting to see who has engaged and who has not engaged as much in the project. And it does come down to, as Alison was saying, individuals with the enthusiasm to plot and add locations, and actually add our volunteers like Rob that are going through incredible amounts of information that we've made available to them online that can also be plotted. But Nottingham just happens to have, we've done very little active outreach to Nottingham, bar a few emails to announce the project and a few follow-up responses. But one man in particular there just really got engaged and has mapped hundreds of locations. You would never realize how queer Nottingham is. It is in fact it is the most mapped location on Pride of Place after London. Probably adding up multiple, Brighton, Manchester, a few other cities altogether, there aren't as many locations mapped. Of course, that brings up another issue of how representative does the map become when a place like Nottingham on this map is incredibly significant and suggests Nottingham as a queer wondrousness. I've never been, so maybe I'm not being fair to Nottingham. I need to go up there, but I'm living in Brighton right now, and I would have anticipated more locations in Brighton, but I suppose now I can be the volunteer that starts adding all kinds of locations to Brighton. But that does, it is important though to get more locations outside of the expected location, of expected communities and cities, London and Brighton for instance. And I think certainly LGBTQ history, though not exclusively, has emphasized the significance of London and the Southeast, especially in a project like Pride of Place, really allows us to think about what's going on in other places and what history exists in other places outside of Metropolis. And and even of rural queer histories. Certainly, this project, again, because of the nature of who's involved in submitting locations and the access points that we have, urban histories naturally predominate, but it does leave space for non-urban histories to be included as well, and to suggest that there is far more than Soho as a location of the LGBTQ past. I think I'll leave it at that, because I think there's probably quite a few areas of conversation that we can continue with. So thank you all so much for coming to learn about the project, and we're very excited to speak further.